So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our educational webinar proudly hosted by the International Trade Council. I am Anne, your host for today's session. So, before we delve into the core content, let's ensure our technical setup is flawless. Could you kindly indicate in the chat box if my voice is clear and the presentation is visible for everyone? So, let's take a moment for everyone to respond for it. Okay, so I think that our attendees are very late or late right now. So I believe that my mic is clear to your end as well, Jonathan, right?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And since I also check your on my screen that your presentation is all right. Well, thank you so much for confirming this technical setup. So thank you for everyone. So today's session promises to be enlightening and engaging, focusing on currency fluctuations affecting trade. So we're honored to have our distinguished speaker for today, Mr. Jonathan Hans Papi, the CEO at VX Global Incorporation, join us, bringing a wealth of experience and insights. Without further delay, let's welcome our speaker. You can start
Hi.
now.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm honored to present to you today on an issue that affects any company that's doing business in foreign markets. When that is the international currency fluctuations, particularly when it comes to trade. And so, what we're going to be covering today is a number of subjects. This won't probably be a long webinar, but it'll be fact-based, and I'll cover as many points as I can. And then, of course, you'll be able to reach out, and there'll be a white paper that'll be made available to those of you that want it. And we'll also be looking at helping you with further analysis if you require it or you need guidance. So, first of all, everybody knows that currency changes happen. There's not a lot of information on the news on how this impacts the global economy, but it actually is a very significant factor. The first time it was really brought to my attention personally, and why I wanted to start to look at it, was one of our clients essentially started to hemorrhage and lose quite a bit of money simply because their relationship with a United States purchaser had changed. So, because of the devaluation of the dollar against the Mexican peso, the manufacturer was getting less pesos, and they have to pay all their bills in pesos. So, they didn't have any protective clauses in their agreements. Their contract stood. There was no way to get out of it, and their profit margins were running roughly 8% prior to the currency fluctuation, and then afterwards there was almost a 20% drop in the exchange rate. It's probably about 17 or 18 in total, and so they went from a +8 to a -8, and they had to sustain that loss until just recently, when there was some corrections in the dollar to peso market. So those are things that you can predict. Those are things that you can, if you're on the trade level, those are things that you can mitigate. We're going to cover that. What we're going to be looking at is just kind of an overview on how currencies go into flux, and then we're going to be looking at the reasons behind that, and how you can have some analysis if you are dealing with a partner a trading partner whose country may be unstable or have be strengthening in the market. So there's a lot of things. We're going to cover the overview of international currency fluctuations. So there's a lot that happens in international currency exchange rate. It can be inflation. It can be interest rates. It can be economic policies. The central banks of different countries also will determine, you know, how currency is looked at through forex. Um, in what I'm going to do is just going to give you some specific examples of what's happened to countries. So when Brexit happened, the British pound dropped roughly about 10% against the dollar on the day that Brexit became in effect. And so all the trade between the United States and Great Britain was affected because 10% is a lot, especially again if you're running on low margins, on 5 and 6 and 7% margins, that can wipe you out. So that was an historic event that happened. Another historic event that happened was the U.S.-China trade war, where the yuan took a serious hit against the U.S. dollar because of uncertainty on how tariffs, et cetera, were going to affect the Chinese, right? And that still plays out today. So we saw repercussions in the Chinese economy due to the fact, and also in consumer prices in the American economy, due to the fact that there was a trade war, there were tariffs, and there was a lot of gamesmanship going on the political level. And so that really affected the manufacturing markets over in China. They couldn't get a lot of, I worked in that market, and there was a lot of times when previously you would be able to get terms on credit. You couldn't get them anymore. It was all cash up front, and the prices had gone up. So it slowed trade, and it slowed the process in the U.S. because the U.S. is a credit-based market. This affected manufacturing economies. It affected profit margins. It affected export-import balance and trade. So I'm bringing these up because it's important to understand that this is a very serious concern, and you should be addressing it. And it can impact you on a personal level, and it also impacts nations on a national level. So that's kind of how it impacts it. And then what are the kind of, we're going to cover more topics on this, but I want to get into this is an introductory overview, so we're going to cover that. So what are the hedging strategies for business? So hedging strategies for businesses can be, first of all, look at currency fluctuations and factoring them into either A, your contracts, which we will cover in detail later, or and B, be aware. I mean, there are certain things that war can't be controlled. A trade war, usually you're going to see coming. Usually there's some kind of negotiations, so you have to be prepped for that. Market indexes, investment, all can affect it as well. And so these are things where you should be looking at the outward bound economic factors as you view your relationship between buyer and seller. Okay, because if his prices go up if the seller's price goes up by 10%, your profit margins go down by 10%. If and vice versa, if the currency exchange is in the other direction, it's not favorable. It's favorable to you. It's not favorable to them because they still have to pay for goods, services, the manufacturing costs. Okay, government intervention and policy. Now, here's the thing: most governments really don't intervene that frequently in the forex issues and the currency issues unless it's going to be something that's very drastic. So there's no way to rebalance the interpretation of the forex community in the currency exchange rate as those trading mechanisms and those modules are analyzed. So government policy can affect it by if they're trying to clamp down on inflation or there's tight credit markets, that can mitigate some of the damage. But typically don't look for government for relief, and that's an important thing, very important thing to realize, because government's typically not going to step in, and government's typically not going to save you on this process. So on we're going to cover some of the the definitions on currency ratios and what can happen here, and just get you educated, and the importance of understanding currency fluctuations, not ratios as much. So um, there's several ways to analyze currency. One of them is the foreign market exchange, and this involves looking at how banks, institutions, hedge funds are interacting, and the rates that they are looking at within the dynamics of the market. Uh, I want to get more specific into this. So, if banks are moving out of sectors or moving out of certain import-export markets, that's going to affect the credit market. That's going to affect the global currency. Those changes typically aren't as overwhelming as let's on the political front. We're going to cover that. But you have to be aware of it, because as those move and as economic stability moves, the potential of a more massive movement is like a predictor, more or less. Like I would say, a volcano is going to shoot out some plumes of smoke before it actually erupts, and so those are things that you have to be aware of. And in the white paper, we cover that in detail. The fixed exchange rate system is something that happens when is a definition when other currencies peg themselves to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. dollar has been the most stable currency in the world for quite some time now. Obviously, it's being challenged by BRICS. My personal opinion is that's not going to happen, and the dollar is going to remain strong. But that's the term we use that pegging. So everything is related to the dollar as far as exchange. So even if you have two rates of exchange between two countries, if they peg to the U.S. dollar and you're paid in U.S. dollars, then that's what you're going to have to look at. So that depends on the banks that you use, and that also depends on the country policy and some other factors that you have to take into consideration. One of the areas that we also want to cover is actually the view, the geopolitical events and views. So on the geopolitical front, something happened, and I use Mexico because when I work with Mexico and I work with the United States, and I also work with China, but we had an election here in Mexico, and she seems to be, she's going to be a great president. She's the first female president that Mexico has ever had. So lots of change there. But actually what happened during the process was that the dollar, which had sharply decreased against the peso, became of less value, simply because the future geopolitical view was that she was not going to be centric to working with the United States as much. And the Morena Party, which had won a number of seats, now the majority in Mexico, wasn't perceived as being quite as friendly as some of the more conservative elements that are in Mexico. I don't believe personally that that's true. From what I see happening in Mexico, there's an increase in infrastructure. The economy is doing very well, but that was the perception. So what happened is immediately afterwards, there was a 7 to 10% bump up against the dollar, which is actually good for Mexico. But it happened immediately, and it didn't happen because of any economic facts. It didn't happen because there was any change in the rates. Nothing changed except a potential transfer of power, or a transfer of power that's up and coming. And so the traders said, well, here's how we feel from a geopolitical standpoint, and that changed the dynamic. So you have to be aware that geopolitical events, something you can't predict, will come in and change the rate of exchange in your currency, and end up changing how you get paid as a person. So in the smaller countries, it's political stability and instability. So if you have a country that is unstable, let's say you have a constant turnover of governments, there's no real understanding of who's in power. Those are countries that are going to have a vastly difficult time in justifying their currency in the international marketplace. And again, we are talking going back to the pegging. They may say, well, all our contracts are in US dollars and suffer the consequences of that. So I hope that helps out for your understanding. Very simple. Currency appreciation makes exports cheaper and imports more expensive, potentially increasing your trade surplus. And then currency depreciation. Currency appreciation makes exports more expensive and imports cheaper, potentially leading to trade deficits. On a micro level, I mean, you would want your currency to be stronger, depending on what home country you're in, right? Other than the fact of it, if it's lower, if it's changed and it strengthens in value, then you're getting less, which is again the U.S. American view of things. So you want to be aware of that. That's a very simple. The very simple a portion of this mental exercise. So where we're going to get into price adjustments and market volatility, and how do we stop that? So there are a few ways that you can look at to mitigate it. So this is the solution side of the coin, and we're going to get into currency clauses, fixed rate of exchange, hedging agreements, escalation clauses, and net investment hedging. So a currency clause is a contract that involves international transactions, where it specifies the currency payments and it specifies the currency pricing. What this does is help manage the risks except with the currency fluctuations. So that might be it might be a flat, like we're signing a contract, and it's what yuan to the dollar, and this is what it is, and it's fixed. So if the yuan increases or the dollar goes up, then that has to be proportional. And so there's very specific language for that. What that does is what we call in the United States even Steven. So if you're going to receive essentially the same amount of money in your local currency as you would have before, regardless of the rate of exchange. And so there's so that kind of covers that. Those are sometimes hard to get because what it can do is it can actually end up hurting both parties. So but it is possible if you're doing long-term business. There's currency hedging agreements, and what these are kind of stopgap measures where there's a recovery over term, or there is a tool built into the contract of the future of the swap, where the agreement is that if there's a currency change, you might get temporary losses or temporary bumps, but you're going to have to make that up to the party within, let's call it 2 to 5% or whatever the profit margins are. So it allows it's a little bit more flexible of a contract. It can still damage a company, it can still damage relationships, but it's recoverable. So those kind of contracts can be written on a 30-day to a quarterly basis over term. So in other words, if you have a little bump in the markets and it just happens to be for 3 or 4 weeks, it really doesn't affect the contract. If it's going to be long term and if it extends out over that term, then there's recovery clauses on the loser side so that they don't suffer any losses. There are escalation clauses which can be built into a contract, and those are pretty simple. The escalation clauses are simply put, if there's a currency move on one part, within that 7 day period or within a specified 30-day period, that the contract itself adjusts, which is very similar to fixed, except it has a little bit more flexibility in that it might not be that fix might not be executed within the first 7 or 30 days. It might be over a longer term, just to allow for bumps in the economy, because it's going to happen. I would get into net investment hedging, but that's really a different market. That's a term you should be familiar with. And that's more used to protect the value of investments overseas. That's not the format today that we're working on. So we're going to go ahead and move to the next slide, and hopefully save your questions till the end, because I just want to go ahead and we'll get through the next couple of slides and we'll be into the Q&A. So the influence on capital cost and the investment decisions that are made. The influence on capital costs, if there is a major currency fallout or there's a major currency change, can go backwards, particularly against the manufacturer or somebody who's assuming the production and the shipping. Those contracts are fungible as far as shipping is concerned, but whoever's assuming the cost of the production of the good or the service, they have to look at what their capital cost could be if there's a fluctuation or a change. So if I went to charge you $100,000 and then that $100,000 ended up turning into $80,000 for me, but it took me $95,000 to produce that, then I have a problem. And so you have to be aware as a manufacturer and even as a purchaser, what's going to come up to affect that food chain as you're doing business. So from the side of the producer, obviously it's imminent. From the side of the purchaser, if costs have to go up from the producer, then you might have to end up passing costs on to your end user. If you're an intermediary, you're not an end buyer. So if you're let's say you're Walmart and you're purchasing a bunch of stuff from China, and then all of a sudden it costs more. Well, what has to happen? You're working on certain profit margins. You can't change those. So now you have to look down line and say, well, we have to increase the price of our goods sold. And so that needs to be built into your modeling as you work in the international trade markets. And I know for some of you this is very basic, and for some of you you're going, well, I've seen this before. And so how's that going to impact you? So if your end consumer is price sensitive and can't withstand a 5 or 10 or 15% jump, and you're going to lose sales, now you're going to go back, you're going to order less product. And so again, we get into a spiral situation. And so this is where the cost of capital and the cost of investment by both parties in their relationship, you really need to have a separate clause or agreement put together so that you can address both problems, because it could affect your business quite drastically moving forward. And again, I will point to the supplier in Mexico who was very famous, supplying a very famous company up there, and to consumer good. And they did make the adjustment eventually. And what happened was that sales dropped by 7%. And that became a very big issue because that they're retailers, so they're not making as much. So understanding currency exchange rates and understanding how they can affect the markets is very, very important to companies. Can't stress it enough. The central bank's role. Central banks can influence currency value by adjusting rates, which reflects the flow of foreign capital in the country. Again, it's geopolitical. If you have an unstable government, you're going to have problems regardless of what that country's central bank does. But the larger, more established countries, the European countries, Latin America is getting a lot more well established than it used to be. There's still some issues there. Um, Asia is fine. Those central banks who can change their policy, do they do it? Not always. So again, you can't rely on what the economic policy is of a country or a government intervention again. And again, that's a strong point. Protect yourself, get a contract that makes sense, um, and go from there. So just to give you a kind of an overview, a finishing overview of not a finished overview of this, but recap so far. So a lot of times when the currency changes, it's due to currency speculations. As I covered in the geopolitical point before, it wasn't about anything that happened. There wasn't any change in Mexico's economic condition, but there was just speculation. And so currency speculation and trading in that Forex market can strongly affect the exchange rate itself. That's obvious that they can affect the price impact, and the volatility risks we have already covered. So I think pretty well. So I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Um, this is standard. Yeah, no, lower inflation is better for a country than higher inflation. Higher inflation, look at what happened in the United States. The private credit markets in the United States are suffering vastly. There's been huge economic changes in the United States that no one is talking about due to geopolitical reasons. The credit markets are not doing well. Housing is backed up. The prices haven't come down that much yet, simply because people can't get out of their houses. But purchasing is slowed down because people can't afford higher mortgages with higher goods, cost of higher goods and higher services. So when you look at a country that you're doing business with, that's something to look at. How's their inflation rate? How stable is their central bank? What is their outlook? So do a country analysis, or you can talk to us about that prior to doing a business in any country. That's just smart. And they do have country ratings systems out there that are very sophisticated, and you can always avail yourself of those tools. I think we've pretty much covered that. So I'm gonna stop here and go ahead and switch over, and we will take questions in the chat. And as I said, I wanted to give a solid overview, not dive in too deep into the complexities of currency exchange rates, but just to give a solid overview. So is there anything, Lady Ann, you want to jump in or?
Yes, actually. So thank you so much um for your enlightening or insightful presentation. So now let's delve into your questions, if there's any. Please continue to type them in the Q&A tab or on the chat box, and I'll select a few for our speaker to address it live. So let's make this interactive and insightful for everyone. Let me go ahead if there's any questions. So far there is no other questions. Okay, I encourage everyone to ask a question if there's any that you would like to ask. So, but before that, before we conclude, I'd like to share also a few important announcements for everyone that today's session has been recorded and will be accessible on the ITC YouTube channel, serving this as valuable resources for everyone. And attendees not yet a member of the ITC are also eligible for a free membership, so don't miss out on this opportunity to join our community. And lastly, all of the participants to this webinar will receive a certificate of participation. Please also watch your email for further instructions. So
Yeah.
let me go ahead. Okay, so I have one question from Mr. Chrysanthus. What's the best way to hedge currency fluctuations in international trade?
Be aware. I mean, there's no that, and contractually, you need to protect yourself with a contract when in place between buyer and seller, if you can, if you're in a position to do that. In some situations, the seller may not want to see that kind of clause. They might welcome it, but you can. I've left my email in the chat room there, and so you can reach out and I can give you a little bit more. What's the best way to hedge currency fluctuations in international trade? The best way is to protect yourself. I mean, have some kind of clause. Again, have some kind of clause in your contract. Stay aware of the markets if you can. Um, uh, Understand your business. Understand that it's not just a simple buy sell. Like if you happen to be in China or in the United States or in Europe, and it's not a buy sell relationship between two people in that country, and currency definitely affects what you're going to do. So you might want to educate yourself a little bit. Please email me, about that, and we can give you some tools for that as well.
Thank you so much. So I also have a question here
Yeah.
from Miss Anna Carter. I am concerned about multiple currency exchange rates. As we supply our contracts with foreign partners, multiple currency fluctuations rates.
Yeah, I would suggest that you look at pegging, um, as far as not allowing them to escape. When you lock up a contract that it can't, despite the currency, it can't move. So that's very similar to the last question, because if you're dealing with multiple currencies, then what do you have? You have where you have to monitor and manage what, 10, 50, or look at 10 or 15 countries. That's not actually viable. So what you would definitely want to do is have an agreement in the contract that, regardless of what the changes are in the currency, that certain guidelines and minimums are met. So if you're that, and the problem is, so what are you accepting? In other words, if you were accepting a peso or a yuan or some other type of currency, what do you do? Then you can't. I mean, essentially, you have to say, look, it's going to be dollar for dollar, and you're going to have to peg. So that's something that you have to be aware of. Now, if you're trading, okay, you've got foreign partners. Again, that's something that needs to be pre-negotiated, because you can't come back at them and say, look, your currency changed, so we need to change our contracts, because that could substantially affect them and their business. So going into those contracts, into those partners, with those partners, or you can say, look, we're going to have to modify our contracts, and this is what we're going to have to do, and do it at a time when it's both parties are of benefit. Okay. So again, I've seen with our clients a number of situations where this comes up, and they're so happy to get the contract that and get a new partner and get revenue in, that they don't forward think. And so you have to have those clauses put in. So I'm going to end there. It looks like yours is a little bit more. You might want to email me. It looks like yours is a little more complex than others, because you're dealing with multiple currencies in multiple countries, and that could be very, very dangerous if those clauses aren't in place.
Thank you. So there's a follow-up questions like example purchasing in Africa to import to America, combining inputs from Mexico to sell to Asia.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to understand a little bit more about that. I'm not saying that it's without, then you're looking at using a third party software. I think in most cases, and would have to figure out what the terms and conditions are on the Africa purchases into the United States. Is it mining? Is it controlled? What is it? We don't know what the product is. And then so from what I'm understanding, you're purchasing from Africa, then your inputs from Mexico, I'm assuming that there's some kind of assembly in Mexico, and then selling to Asia. So that's a big, long supply chain, right? And so you have multiple variables built into that, and that's kind of not a dangerous scenario if you know what you're doing, but it's also scary because you don't know, if you're working on a 10% margin again, or even a 15 or 20% margin, those margins can change drastically when you wake up in the morning. So yeah, I would say just email me directly, and we can go over some solutions.
Okay, thank you so much. So actually, I have a question here from Cecilia Perotto. Could you please give us an example of how to assess a country to do business with, for example, Brazil or Argentina?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. One is obviously to look at the trajectory of the currency, and do a historical review of that currency, and look at, there's charts available on Forex where you can track a currency, and again, I can help you do that. I think that's one way to do it, and then to do kind of an in-depth dive into the change of that country, or what that country is doing. For example, let's take Argentina. Argentina has a new president. He's very conservative, independent. Complete change from that for that country. They were a leftist country, and then just decided that they needed change. In the so it's a new government. So how is that new government going to be perceived? So the major factors are the history of the currency, inflation and/or deflation in that country. Typically, it's inflation. We rarely see deflation, and then stability of the country is looked at. And then there's tools out there that will do a deeper dive, and you get into country ratings and forecastings for countries. I believe Dun& Bradstreet still has it, and there's a few others that I can certainly turn you on to. But going in is you need two assessments. You need an assessment of your partner, obviously, right? Because we've been in transactions on the purchase order side and the credit facilitation side where somebody wanted to have a $5 million purchase order, and we said, well, let us look at your buyer, right? And find out that they have $22,000 in the bank, and they were just going to sell through. So that's one factor of making sure that you do due diligence. And then and a second factor, again, is it the geopolitical environment there, and the other things that were already mentioned. And above and beyond that, at times you just don't know. And then that's it, so again, I go back to, you should have factors or contracts in place that address the issue, instead of second guessing and kind of dipping your toe in the water without that, if you can.
Thank you so much. So let me check if there is any other questions from everyone. So I think there is no other questions here.
I put my email in the chat. I'll do it again, and then I'll put our website in there, so you can reach out to us should you have any questions, or if you want to receive the white paper, which is still being worked on, but it's not a huge white paper. It's small. That could be helpful as well. So if you want to get in touch with me, feel free, and I'll go ahead and turn it over you for the close.
Okay, perfect. So aside from that, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with others or with everyone?
Especially from the one question from Anna, and some of and Dr. Ananji, and I guess there was a couple more. You need to look at contracts, currency clauses as part of your contract moving forward. And if you don't have them and you can get them going backwards, definitely do it, because it can come up and really destroy a situation very, very quickly. And so it's something that in the course of doing business, we don't always project. We're looking at building our business. We're looking at how can we get into this foreign market, and we're looking at expansion. And if you overlook this component, it can be the death of your efforts and a lot of loss of capital.
Thank you so much. So everyone, if there is anyone who wanted to ask a question for Mr. Jonathan, the email, I will show this one on the stage also. So the email is on the screen right now. You can contact him directly, and I will also leave my email address here for those not yet a member of the ITC. Please feel free to contact me as well. So okay, I believe everything is okay right now. So there is no other question from everyone. So thank you so much to you, our speaker, Mr. Jonathan, for sharing your expertise with us today, and to all of the participants. Thank you for your active participation and thoughtful questions. Your engagement enriches our webinar. Remember, the journey towards excellence is ongoing. So let's apply the insights gained today to drive success in our endeavors. Check your email also for follow up information, including how to claim your certificate. We wish you a wonderful day and look forward to welcoming you to future webinars. Goodbye for now, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Yep.
Jonathan.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Have a good day.